Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This episode is brought to you by AutoRescueTools.com and Isaac Rodell. If you are looking to get into module programming, but you are not sure what kind of laptop you're going to need or how to set it up for programming, Isaac is your guy. He can set up laptops specifically to do control module programming for specific brands with partitioned hard drives and all the software that you're going to need to do this. He also sells key cutting equipment, scan tools, and other diagnostic equipment. I bought some stuff from him in the past and the support is phenomenal. So I highly recommend checking out the website. Again, that's AutoRescueTools.com. The link will be in the show notes. Hey, have you ever been faced with the challenge of sourcing, installing, and programming a used control module in a vehicle? I know a lot of us have. It seems to be happening more and more often today with the volume of control modules on vehicles, the cost of some new ones, or even the availability of new control modules. In some cases, used may be the only option. So what do you do here? I strongly recommend checking out SJ Auto Solutions and Tommy Oliva. Tommy offers a cloning service for used control modules to make these things plug and play for the vehicle that you're working on. In a lot of cases, he is also able to source the control modules if you're unable to locate one for the vehicle that you're working on. But once you get connected with Tommy, he's going to offer fantastic support from start to finish to make sure that that control module is going to work in your application. He's also got tech support that he offers through his website, along with some free resources there as well on information about used control module programming. So make sure to check out SJ Auto Solutions. I can't recommend that enough. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. You're stuck with just me again. We'll get some guests on soon enough. But for this week, I got another case study to share with you. We'll be talking about network stuff this week. I do that frequently on the show. But like I've mentioned, try to reflect what's in the show based on what we are getting the most calls on and doing out in the field, doing this mobile diag thing. Lots and lots of calls for network stuff. It can be time consuming. It can definitely be challenging. A lot of shops and techs just don't want to deal with it. They see a U code or they can't talk to a module. They'll do a few checks. And if they don't get anywhere, end up calling us or, sending it somewhere else, whatever. You can work through these problems. Of course, the intermittent ones are really challenging and we struggle with those too. Like if we can't duplicate it, it's going to be pretty tough. We can guess, but that's really all it is. I've had a number of them recently where it's intermittent communication faults, and especially when like every module on a network is setting the faults and the network spans the length of the vehicle. If you can't get it to happen, it's going to be really, really, really tough to figure it out. Of course, you could do a visual of the wiring, but does that run under carpets, under the dash, under the hood, in the trunk, underneath the vehicle? You're not going to be able to do a visual of the entire thing. Maybe you'll find something, maybe you won't. How much time are you going to spend tearing a harness apart to do a visual? It doesn't often make sense to do that, right? Could it be a module? Sure. Could it be a power or ground to a module, right? That expands the network even more. If you consider like a missing power or missing ground to a module could corrupt a whole network. I'm not talking just one module not communicating. I'm talking the entire network is corrupted from a missing power or ground for one module. It happens. It does. And there's ways you can identify that, but only when it's happening, right? So yeah, we could have an issue with the physical network itself. We could have a, open or short in the network wires, and we could have a problem in the modules. But now we could even have a problem on the circuitry, the wires that provide power and ground to those modules. So that makes this even more cumbersome to try to narrow down exactly what's going on. And we try to explain that to shops. It's like, hey, man, if this isn't happening, if we can't duplicate it in a reasonable period of time with our testing equipment hooked up, good luck. It's going to be cheaper for you to just guess at stuff. But in that situation, when you can have so many different things causing a single problem, it's really, really difficult. So intermittent problems are the bane of my existence. um, you know, we try to avoid them as much as we can, but we get roped into them. And sometimes the shop doesn't realize that it's intermittent. And there's been a number of times where that's happened. Like the problem is happening for them. And then as soon as we get there, it doesn't happen for, an hour of testing. I actually had that recently with a Toyota Prius. It was an '09 Prius that like the whole high speed can would go down. You get red triangle on the dash for the hybrid system. Every single module on the high speed bus has communication codes, like the entire network's going down. And whenever we would get there, these codes would be present. We went back to this vehicle probably 3, 4 times because the shop's like, yeah, it's dead in the water again. And we'll test it for an hour plus and we can't get it to happen. Driving the thing around, doing this, doing that, like nothing. Like the codes are in there. We document them, we clear them, go drive around, can't get this thing to act up. And after the third trip or whatever, I'm like, dude, like the I don't know what to do or how to help you on this because we can't even come close to having this happen while we're connected with our test equipment. And explaining to him what I just went through of like it could be so many different things. Because a lot of shops are like, well, what do you think it could be? How much time do you got? Let's pull up a diagram and point to the 50 different things that it could be. Um, any one of the modules, any one of the circuits. We don't know until like maybe if I had a waveform, I could give you a little bit of a better answer, like a waveform wall, it's faulty. I could say, okay, well, here, look, the bias voltage is here. Maybe this is missing ground, or this could be an open network, right? But I don't even have that. All I have is some codes where everybody's doing the Spider-Man meme, pointing at each other of, hey, it's his fault. Hey, I can't talk to him. Hey, I can't talk to him. Like everybody's upset. So, I mean, I can assume the whole network's going down, but I don't have a reason. Anyways, on this particular Prius, it ended up, it was the shop scan tool. They had an older Snap-on tool, and literally every time they plugged in with their tool, it shut down the whole network on the car. And the only way I found that is I was like, hey guys, show me the problem. Because the tech was convinced, and this was accurate, that every time he went to do the diagnostic, the codes were present. They were because his tool was causing it. We proved it. And strangely enough, because I was messing around, I had my breakout box connected to this thing so I was doing testing at the DLC. If you hooked up the Snap-on tool through the breakout box, it didn't cause any faults, but directly to the DLC it did. So I don't know if it's a tool thing, a cable thing. It didn't really matter to me. I showed him, I'm like, okay, well, look here, we plug in yours, problem. We plug in my tool, no problem. And so that was the fix is don't connect your Snap-on tool to this Toyota Prius. Now, I don't think that's all Snap-on tools. They had it was an older, I don't know, it was a Solus something or another. I don't use Snap-on tools, so I don't even know the different variations, but I do know that that was causing the problem, right? And we got to the resolution on that vehicle. There's no problem with the car. It was the tools that they were using, but that's the sort of scenario that we get into. I mean, I like them when they're hard faults, right? It's broken right now. If it's broken right now, or at least consistently enough, I'm pretty confident I can find the source of what's going on. Now I say that and I'll get one tomorrow that just kicks my ass, even though it's a hard fault. That happens too. And actually that's the one I'm going to be talking about today was a pretty interesting one that, to be totally honest, was a little bit of luck that allowed me to find the issue on it. But if these things are broke right now, it makes it so much easier. I had a Chevy truck the other day, big 3,500 diesel truck. The whole high speed was down. And this thing had actually been at the shop for like 3 weeks. They've been messing around with it, couldn't find a solution. The customer had actually done his own head gaskets on this diesel motor. So the thing was just a disaster. There's wires cut everywhere and harnesses laying out, and they had also been poking and prodded at it at the shop. And I ended up finding the high speed cam high was shorted directly to ground. And interesting enough, I ohm check those GM daisy chain CAN networks and they should be 60. And if they are, it tells me a ton about that network because of the construction. And it's important to know the construction of the network that you're diagnosing. But it was 60 ohms. So everything's connected, everything's plugged in. There are no open wires, there are no connectors for the actual modules that are disconnected or the inline connectors that are disconnected. But the one of the sides of the can was actually shorted directly to ground. And the only way I saw that was, well, one side had voltage on it, one side had zero when referencing ground. But if you reference power with your scope or even your test light, it was a straight shot to ground. So that lit up my test light when I had a powered up test light. So, anyways, what we ended up finding out was there was a connector that was flipped 180 degrees that had CAN lines on it. And this was causing the network to be shorted directly to ground. And they really had to jam this connector together to get it to seat properly. And, now that I'm actually saying that out loud, I paused a little bit ago. I'm like, why did it read 60 ohms when this connector that had CAN wires on it was flipped and it was shorting a wire to ground? I'm gonna look into that because I didn't really think about that. We ended up finding that was the problem. I flipped the connector the way it was supposed to be, and it actually broke the female side of the connector, but the pins still lined up. But we flipped it around, got communication back, and they were able to move forward with that truck. But I'm actually gonna look into that. I'll research and get back to everybody as to why that read 60 when I just said all the connectors have to be right. This one definitely wasn't. So I'll look into the diagram and I'll get back to you on that. So learning in the moment. Anyways, let's get to the one I want to talk about today, which I do have full conclusion and all the details on. It's a 2017 Subaru Forester. A customer called me to diagnose an Eyesight system warning light, and I've had lots of fun with the Eyesight systems on Subarus. Previous podcast on that. This is the stereo camera system for the ADAS features in these Subarus, very common. We'll scan it and we'll see, hey, does this thing need a calibration, a camera, what's going on with it? So I get there and just about every module that I can talk to on my pre-scan says loss of communication with Eyesight. The cluster, the transmission, brake control, body control, they're all saying, hey, we can't talk with the Eyesight module. And I can't talk to the Eyesight module either with my scan tool. So, okay, well, that's why the warning is on the dash along with a few others. It wasn't the only warning on the dash, but it's the one that the customer noticed and called us about. So, one thing I like to do if I have no communication to a particular module, which it seems to be the case here, I'm just going to check fuses before I really get into depth with anything network related or anything like that. Let's just check some fuses and see. And this is a used car lot. They buy stuff from the auction. A lot of times with auction vehicles, they will just yank fuses randomly out of these things. It's some, I don't know, scam or something so that they can get a better deal on the vehicles. I don't exactly understand how it works. I'm not involved in the auction world. If you are, you probably know all about it. But I see a lot of these vehicles out in the world and just random fuses have been pulled. And so a lot of things don't work and they're just missing. And a missing fuse can kind of throw a lot of technicians off because they'll test the fuses that are there. But if there's not one there, they don't always know that it should be. Well, you pay attention to the diagram and it can get you to that point. Anyways, I'm going to look at the fuse. This is where I'm going with that, just to see, is it there? Does the power, is it blown? Whatever. This is fuse 4, the under hood fuse, or I'm sorry, the under dash fuse box. So the cabin fuse box on the left side. And I go, it's a 10 amp. I test it. It's blown. Okay, so this provides power to a number of different things. It's a big circuit. And by the way, I have the YouTube video to accompany this one. There is some diagrams on this particular vehicle. So if you have the ability to, I'd recommend watching it on YouTube. I'll do my best to explain it audio only, but there may be a few things where you're like, I'd be helpful to see that. And I agree. And I have some diagrams up. They're all from All Data. So credit to All Data. I have permission to use them. So anyways, this powers up a number of things this fuse for, one of them being the Eyesight module, but it's blown. Okay, so blown fuse. All right, well, let's start there. Let's put a fuse in. So that's it. Let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time. I fixed it. No, when I put the fuse in, I attempted to clear codes and see what remained. I can't talk to anything once I have a good fuse in there. And the fuse didn't blow again, but the old one was actually popped. And now I can't communicate with anything. So if you ever have a situation like that, you're like, hey, things worked before, at least some things, and I did something, and now things don't work. Undo that thing that you just did. Go back a step and see, does it go back at least to where you were? And I say it that way because there's a lot of situations that I've been in where people don't think of that for some reason, right? Like I had a functioning vehicle, I did this, and now there's a problem that wasn't there before. Maybe it's the thing that I did. And you see this a lot with aftermarket parts. Aftermarket parts are put on to correct whatever problem. And now there's a new problem. And the connection's just not there a lot of the time. You may have caused this, or not you, but you did something to the vehicle and now it exhibits X symptom. Is it possible that whatever you did is causing that? Yeah. So, anyways, I put a fuse in and I can't communicate with anything. So I take the fuse out and I have communication with the modules that I did before. Still no eyesight, but it makes sense. This fuse is for the eyesight module. But for whatever reason, putting the fuse in causes the entire CAN network to go down. And I don't quite understand the network structure or what modules are involved just yet on this thing. I haven't really looked into it, but I do know that my scanner has no communication to the vehicle once I put this fuse in there. Interesting, the old one was blown and this one doesn't blow, but something's going on here. So this is my first step is this looks like a network issue. I need to understand the construction of the network. How's this set up? How's it arranged? Is there a gateway module? Am I hardwired to the DLC? How is the Eyesight module tied in with these networks? All that stuff. I've got to get a grasp on that. So first things first, the high-speed CAN 6 and 14 hardwired to the DLC. And this is the network that I'm pretty much going to talk to the majority of the vehicle on. And yeah, it's pretty much everything on the vehicle I am accessing through the DLC directly there. But it's good to know I'm hardwired. I can do tests right at the DLC if I want to scope or ohm check or whatever I'm doing. I can do it right there. I don't have to go far, right? Put my breakout box on, and then I can have my scan tool hooked up and test the network at the same time if I want to. The Eyesight module is a module on this CAN network too. All right, so if you're following along, I showed you the CAN network there, and the stereo camera, they call it, is on the CAN network. It's red and blue wires that span the whole length of the vehicle, ton of modules on there. And I also want to look at the construction of the network. Is it a traditional bus style where you have the CAN network and legs that go off of it? Or is it a daisy chain style where it goes in through out for the modules? And it looks like there's only one module that's daisy chained, where it's an in through out style, and it's the BCM or body integrated unit. The rest of them, it's more of a bus style, meaning that you have your bus, your network, and then you have legs that go off, right? And so if you unplug a particular module, let's say the stereo camera, the rest of your network is still connected to itself, right? All the other modules have connection if you unplug one module. Now, going back to like a GM style, if you unplug a connector from a module, you've not only lost that module, but you've separated the network into two sections. It's not the case here. Aside from the BCM, it does have an in through out. But anyways, I wanted to get a feel for how this is set up. So now we can come up with a plan. Now that I have a diagram and see where and how I want to test. Of course, the first thing I'm going to do is just test at the DLC and see what I get there. Now, when I have the fuse in place, okay, the fuse is in. Oh, first thing I did is I ohm checked it. It's less important on this one, although the diagram does show me where the terminating resistors are. One of them is in the ABS module, and the other one is, let me see if I can find that, in the ECM, engine control, right? So I ohm check the network and I get 60 ohms. Now, on a network style like this, really the only thing that tells you is that the CAN is not shorted to itself, and it is fully connected to those two modules, right? The ECM and the ABS. It doesn't really tell you if there's an open anywhere else in the network, but I can say for sure that my ECM and my ABS are connected at least. The ohm check is not as valuable in this situation, in this style of network, as it would be in a GM network. But anyways, I do it anyways because it's a low cost test. It doesn't cost me anything to do. It's a couple seconds. Wait for the network to power down. Ohm check it. I got 60. Okay, cool. I'll move on. So now I can scope it, and I want to see what the scope pattern looks like. What's going on this network? So when I scope this, I have a very strange pattern. And I'm using my U-scope. If you look at the YouTube video, you can see it, but I'll describe it to you. If you imagine a CAN network with bias voltage, right, about 2.5 or so. If you're on the CAN high, the voltage is going to go up. And then if you're CAN low, the voltage is going to go down when there's message transmission. Okay, simple enough. Well, what I see on this, on the network, is that it goes both directions. It goes both high and low, which is very strange. And sometimes when you have an open network, you can see this type of pattern, but it really looks like I'm looking at both CAN high and CAN low on the same wire, which is strange, but it definitely uh confirms what's happening with my scan tool, is that there's no way that actual data transmission could happen here. The reason I can't talk to anything when this fuse is plugged in is pretty obvious when I look at the scope pattern. And so at least I have, a fault that I can find. Whatever this is, I'm not entirely sure at this moment, but this is what I need to find within this CAN network. And whatever this is definitely being caused when I put the fuse in place that powers up the Eyesight module. Because when I remove the fuse, although the traffic reduces significantly, I have a normal pattern, right? The data transmission, the voltage pulses are only moving one direction. In the scope pattern, you can see they're going up from the bias to transmit data packets, which is what you want to see. You don't want to see it go up and down on the same waveform. Now, if you're looking at two different channels, the high and the low, yeah, you want to see one going up and one going down. But on a single channel, you should not see the messages moving both directions in voltage off of the bias. Okay. So, but without the fuse, when I take that out, and that's when I can talk to stuff with my scan tool, I have a normal looking CAN pattern. Oh, again, it's reduced traffic significantly, but it's normal and I can communicate with things. So before I really dive in to tearing this car apart, I think I need to pay attention to the diagram, because this fuse, being kind of the key to things, should really help me to narrow it down to certain things, right? I have this entire CAN network with a bunch of different modules, but this fuse changes things for me. So what does this fuse power? Now, I mentioned before, it's not just the stereo camera. It's not just the Eyesight module. There's a whole bunch of other things that this fuse powers. There's probably about 15 different things, 10 to 15 different things. I didn't count them. If you're looking at a diagram, you can count them. But what I did do was I went through and I looked, okay, which one of these are modules and which one of these are modules that live on the CAN network? Because this Fuse 4 10 amp does power up the TPMS, the RAB, the remote engine start control module, the eyesight module, and the left and the right radar sensor. Okay. So those are all modules that live on the CAN network that communicate over this CAN network. And one of those, I believe, is causing this issue. I don't think this is a circuit issue right off of the bat, because if I pull the power supply, I would imagine, to one of these modules, the problem goes away, right? And also the fact that the message, it looks like the CAN network is going high and low on the same circuit. That screams module to me. I can't be for sure, but that's what I'm thinking, right? And I pull this fuse that supplies power to these modules, and it returns to normal. I think I really need to zero in on these modules. Now, what's good here is I've reduced the amount of modules that I need to look at on this network, right? Because if, at first looking at the network, with, you could say like any one of the modules on the network could be causing these problems. Well, no, I know it's one of these because the fuse powers up these modules. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 modules, down from, a total of 20 that exist on the CAN network. So it's helpful that this fuse is kind of the key to it and it limits it down, but I still have to narrow it down a little bit more to figure out who's causing this. So I find these modules on my network, and I'm using the factory diagram again. It's much more helpful than the redrawn in this case. But I have my radar sensor, my RAB, which is rear automatic braking control module. I have my eyesight camera, and then I have my keyless access and remote start control module that all live on here. Did I mention the keyless access? I did. Oh, the TPMS is the keyless access module. So in one diagram, it shows you TPMS, and then in another one, it shows you keyless entry. It's the same module. It's taking the radio transmissions in for the vehicle. So those are all on various places on the network. So I need to do some more narrowing down. Now I can go to these individual modules potentially and unplug them. Of course, the eyesight is top of mind because that's what he called me for. But looking at this, I can't just assume that that's where my issue is, right? There could definitely be one of these other modules, and it just happens to be that the the customer noticed the eyesight thing, and that's you don't want to get tunnel vision from that. It could be, but let's take this approach as, well, how do I do this as efficiently as possible? And to be quite honest, besides the eyesight, I don't really know where all of these modules are in the vehicle. I'm not super familiar with the 17 Subaru and where these live. So I want to see if there's a way I can divide up the network into sections that will guide me there without doing too much tearing apart and trying to find modules. And sometimes that can be a pain. So we're going to divide and conquer this network. I'm going to split it into sections and follow this strange pattern that I see to get me to the source of what's going on. And I also want to try to find the easiest component to get to in order to do this, to split the network. And again, this is where a diagram comes in handy because it's going to show you connectors or junction connectors that you could potentially split the network at. And I see one on the diagram that looks like a great place to start. It's kind of centralized. It has a lot of different legs. And really what it is just a junction connector, which is a comb, or it's two different combs, one for the high side, one for the low side. And we have 12 wires that plug into it. 6 of them are for CAN high, 6 of them are for CAN low. And it just joins all the wires together through a metal comb, right? And so you're linking all the legs of the CAN together at this point. But what's nice is if I unplug it or I take the comb out, well, now I've separated all those different sections of the network, and then I can use my scope and find my bad pattern, if you will. So I-256 is the one that looks good to me that I want to do some testing at. And so I'm able to use the component locator within ALLDATA, and I find it's right under the dash up above the accelerator pedal. And sometimes these diagrams aren't perfect, but if you look at the wiring colors and you look around, you can find it. And I found it up there. It's taped up to a harness. Easy enough to locate. 6 red, 6 blue. Okay, that's my connector. And the factory diagram actually shows you the connector view as well. So you can say, oh, that's what that connector looks like. Okay, cool. I'm on the right one. Now, I did have an issue here. The pins for this junction connector, it's not helpful. Basically all of the blues are labeled as 2 and all of the reds are labeled as 1. And if you go to the connector, it's 1 through 12. But if you look at the details on the factory diagram, it says star with a 1. It says terminal option arrangement among 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if it's a 2, terminal option arrangement among 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So really what that means is any of the red wires could be 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, and 8, and any of the blue wires could be 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And I can look at the connector and I can find the pin number, but it doesn't correlate to a specific one on my diagram. So, Subaru has always been just fantastic with their wiring diagrams. If you've done any work, you know that that's the case. I mean, it's a nice network diagram that I'm utilizing, but it would be really nice if it told me which pins were which. So can I still use this junction connector? I think I can, and I'm going to try. I found it. I can unplug the comb. I'm going to give it a shot and see. I should definitely be able to find the leg of the network that the problem's on, but determining based off of real life at the car on the wire to say where does that wire go using the diagram, it could be tricky, but I'm going to try something and see if it works here. So I find the 2 wires that have the corrupt network, right? So there's 12 wires, and so 6 pairs, if you want to imagine that. 6 pairs of CAN wires going into this comb. And I've taken the comb out, and I find 2 of them that have my weird up and down pattern. Okay, so which leg of the network is that? And I have one highlighted in yellow here on the diagram. Well, how do I know that's the one that is my network on the car? Because they're not organized in a correct order. If you're looking at the diagram, you're looking at the connector, they're not set up that way. So how did I figure this out? Well, I'm right at my DLC, and what I decided to do was, okay, I've unplugged this junction connector and I can still go to my DLC. It's literally like 12 inches from where I'm testing at this junction connector. So I move my scope over to the DLC with the junction connector unplugged, and I still have my bad pattern at my DLC. So what that means to me is the 2 wires on that junction connector that have the bad pattern, those are connected to my DLC. And using the diagram, I can determine what leg of the network that is. Right. So once again, if you're looking at the picture, the diagrams in the YouTube video, this makes more sense. But I've separated the network into individual legs or subsections. And after doing that, my bad pattern still exists at my DLC. So I know that the 2 wires that have the bad pattern at my junction connector are connected to my DLC, right? The rest of them have normal CAN patterns until I plug the comb back in. So now I can use my diagram because I know, oh, it's those 2 wires. They say 1 and 2. It's a red and a blue wire. But I can highlight that section of the network, which I've done in the diagram, and say, this is where my problem exists. This leg of the network is where this garbage message is coming from. And what I can do is I can use my fuse diagram to say, okay, based off of the modules that are powered up from this fuse and live on this leg of the network, I can narrow this down, right? I can get some modules out of the question. Unfortunately, what I find is I've only eliminated 1 module. So we have still several modules, the remote start, the keyless access, the radar modules, and the RAB module, all still on that particular leg that has the bad pattern. Here's what I have eliminated, though, is the Eyesight camera. The Eyesight camera is not on that leg. That leg of the network has a good pattern when separated from the comb. Okay, so it's not the Eyesight. Again, that's why I want to be careful. That's the obvious problem that the customer saw, but it's not the reason that this network is corrupt. So how do we divide this up a little bit further? There is a connector in this diagram, and they list the connector as male and female. One side's B553, the other side's I231. And what's nice, they show you the male and the female side in the diagram, which is helpful, right? Because this one, I can definitely find my pins. It has pin numbers, it shows male, female. I can go to this connector if I can find it, separate it, and test either side and see which direction I'm going. And what this connector is going to allow me to do is that leg of the network that has those modules on it, now I can separate that section into two. I'm just dividing it up even further. So I find this I231, it's literally another 12 inches away from where I was in the left front kick panel. So I find that, and again, you can see these connector pinouts in the diagram, in the factory diagram. So you have an idea of the shape of the connector. And for this one in particular, 2 and 12 are my CAN wires, so I can match up colors to it and say, yep, that's definitely my connector. So I find that, I separate it. Now, one thing I do want you to be careful of if you're just unplugging connectors, depending on the vehicle construction and what's going on there, you could be separated the network in two different places. You want to be careful on that, but you could also be unplugging powers and grounds to particular modules, right? So you unplug a big connector thinking you're just separating the CAN there, but really you've removed a power source to a module. That can get tricky. So be careful with this. And sometimes I will depin, or if I really have to, cut wires in order to separate them. I avoid cutting. If I can depin, that's the way I go. And that way you can leave the rest of the connector hooked up. But in this case, I was okay just unplugging this connector and testing either side of the CAN. And what I found was, after splitting that section up into two, that I could follow it to the bad pattern, right? And it was on the female side of the connector. And so if I follow that side of the network, I'm down to two modules as it shows me on the network, the RAB control module and the radar sensor left hand master is what it says. Those are the only two on there on this leg of the network as far as modules go. And those are both powered by that fuse, of course. So the RAB modules near the spare tire, because at this point I'm like, okay, two modules, I can get to these, I can unplug them individually and see what happens. I'm not going to dig for any more junction connectors or anything like that. I'm just going to go to these modules. Then the RAB was easy to find. I unplugged it. It didn't make any difference. The bad pattern's still there. So now I'm down to one, right? Radar sensor, left hand, master. That's it. So this does require bumper removal in order to access it. So the shop did that and they actually ripped it off pretty quick for me. I'm like, I need to get to this thing to test it and see what's going on. It's probably this module, but we need to do some verification when we get there. So this picture here, take the rear bumper off and you can see it's a blind spot module on the left hand. Okay, so we get there and I unplug the sensor and the network is restored. Plug everything else back in, all the junction connectors and all that stuff's connected back up, fuses in. I unplug the left rear radar module and everything else is good. I can talk to everything except for this radar module and the right side module. And that was one thing that I kind of glanced over when I was looking at this diagram. If you look at the power feed to the fuse feeds both the left and the right radar. The CAN diagram only includes the left-hand radar. Now, it does say master and slave, the left hand being the master, the right hand being the slave. I've been burned on this before with GM stuff. If you're familiar with GM side detection modules, and that's why I'm thinking this way. I'm like, wait, what about the right? On GM side detection modules, the network is daisy chained from the left hand in most cases over to the right, and the right is the slave. And in some of the GM network diagrams, it doesn't show you the right. even though it's a leg of the network, you have to go to the actual side object detection diagram to see the extension of that network over to the right. And the fact of the matter is a shorted out right side module can short the network through the left. Unplugging the left fixes it, but that's not the cause of the problem. The problem's over on the right. I've seen that many times on the GM style. And so I'm thinking that. And the fact that I don't see the right hand in the CAN diagram, but it is powered up by this fuse that I remove and it fixes everything. I'm like, okay, well, is there a extension of the network from the left to the right? And this would be easy enough to test here. You know, I could unplug the right side and see, but I want to look at a diagram and see how is this set up? Is it an extension of the CAN network here? So I do this and you know what, I did unplug the right side and leaving the left side plugged in, and it didn't fix the problem. Problem was still there, although it did change the pattern, but we'll get there. When I looked at the diagram, I saw that there was a CAN network between these two, between the left hand and the right hand. Now it's different colors than the main CAN, but it's definitely a CAN twisted pair, white and brown. The wires for the on the vehicle are white and red to this section. I mentioned white or red and blue before. On the after one of the junction connectors going to the left hand, it goes red and white to the left hand radar. So red and white for the main CAN of the vehicle, and then we have white and brown for this sub CAN. Now, my question is this an extension of the CAN network and we just don't see it on the main diagram, or is this a discrete network that is just between the left and the right radar? And I don't know that, and it doesn't show me that in the diagram. It's not clear. It just shows you those are the wires and they look like CAN wires. I had to do some digging on this. I did. And I did find in service information through the diagnostic trouble codes that this is its own individual CAN network between these two that is completely separate from the rest of the vehicle's CAN, the main CAN. And the way that you can determine this is that it has its own terminating resistors in both the right and the left hand on the CAN network between the two of them, meaning that it's not an extension of the network. We already know where the terminating resistors are in the main CAN, and one of those does not exist in the left hand radar. There are terminating resistors between the two. Again, meaning is its own CAN network just for data to be shared between the left and the right. And then the left reports on the main CAN. All right. So where I'm going with this is if this CAN was shorted, or let's say the right hand radar was an issue here, then it does not have a way, as far as I'm aware, to short out the main CAN network. So this really can't be the right. And again, I proved it by unplugging the right and it didn't change anything. Well, I shouldn't say it didn't change anything. It didn't fix the problem by unplugging the right. Okay, so I'm back to my left side. If I unplug that, I fix the problem. It's no longer there. If I pull a fuse, which powers up this module, it also gets rid of the problem. Okay, so it's a module, right? We're done. We're just replacing this. Now, before you do this, you do want to check powers and grounds to a network or to a module to make sure that they are there. I mentioned earlier, a missing ground or a missing power feed can cause a module to corrupt a network. It's possible. So I do this, and this is easy. I'm right there. And I mean, I know that fuse is getting power, but I'm gonna check it anyways back at the radar. Check my power and ground to this module. Now, here's when I noticed something when I was doing the testing. About 4 or 5 inches down from the connector, there's a noticeable wiring repair that is fresh, right? It had fresh electrical tape wrapped around this wiring repair to this module, which I thought was interesting. I'm like, And I was also thinking along the lines of that fuse was popped. So I pull back this tape just to see, is there anything going on here that I need to be aware of? Because someone was recently in here and did some repair to this. Maybe this thing was in a crash and they fixed some wiring that was cut. Here's what I end up finding out. The connections look fine, but as I'm looking at this, there is two white wires that go to this module. And I mentioned that earlier. The two CAN networks, there's a white wire on that sub CAN between the two modules, and there's a white wire that's on the main CAN for the main vehicle. And I had to do some testing to figure this out. But what I ended up finding out, and this is kind of where the diagram is going to help you visualize to see what's going on, is that, excuse me, if you look at the CAN low on the main CAN of the vehicle, which is the white wire, it was connected to the white wire on the sub CAN going to the left-hand radar, which is CAN high. So, and I know that's confusing. That's why the diagram is helpful. CAN low of the main CAN was connected to CAN high of this sub CAN. And the CAN low going to the left-hand module was connected to CAN high of the sub hand going to the right. And I realize that's confusing to explain audio only. So if you're listening and you don't have the diagram in front of you, just picture this. There was two white wires. They were both CAN, but two different CAN networks, and they were crossed. So we were injecting the data from the sub CAN onto the main CAN when this left-hand module was connected and plugged in and had power. And so we were actually getting CAN high messages from a network that had completely different message structure onto CAN low, which was corrupting the entire thing. But only when this left hand was powered up. You take away the power from the left hand and actually the right hand at the same time, and the problem is gone. Everybody can still talk, even though that CAN wire is tied into another CAN network. Take a look at the diagram in the YouTube video, and it makes a little bit more sense as to what I'm talking about. But when they did this wiring repair, they crossed the two white wires. They did a good repair, like, physically it was fixed, but it was wrong. So we cut and moved those over, plugged everything back in, good to go. Talked to everything, both the radars, eyesight, all that stuff. You can leave the fuse in. It also makes sense why that fuse was blown, because that probably happened when those wires got smashed and the fuse just never got replaced, was my guess. The fuse never blew for me, so I was assuming that was the case. So anyways, that was pretty interesting, what was causing that. And to be totally honest, just the fact that I happened to look at that wiring repair when I was doing my testing, it just gave me like, I should look at this because it was so fresh, because it looked like someone just did a repair there. And that's the only reason I went for that. So a little bit of luck there, but you do sort of pick up on this stuff as you go through, and something like that'll stand out to you. You're like, ooh, I need to look at that. I need to see something about that. My spidey sense is tingling here. I need to see if everything is okay here. And that's where it ended up being. So it wasn't a module, it was a wiring repair that went wrong. And it makes sense on the waveform that we were seeing too, right? Some of the messages going high, some of the messages going low. Well, again, we were tying in a CAN high to a CAN low from a totally separate network. So that's why we had the pattern that we did. So anyways, that's what I got for you today. Hopefully you found that interesting. But with that all the way, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.